Good evening, dear Ivy. Bonsoir. I'm Thierry Lagneau. I'm the director of Alliance Française Dublin. And on behalf of the European Union National Institute for Culture, EUNIC in Ireland, I am delighted to welcome you to the European Book Club. This series is a monthly discussion on a best-selling novel in English translation. And for this discussion, we have the author of the selected novel. For the second session of the European Book Club, the French Embassy and the Alliance Française Dublin are thrilled, delighted to present French author Anne Garréta, who will talk about Sphinx, the first genderless love story in French. The conversation will be presented and moderated by Jean-Philippe Imbert, Professor of Comparative Literature and Sexuality Studies at DCU. Jean-Philippe, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to you all, regardless of wherever you may be in Ireland or in the world. Very much like me, we are delighted to welcome you, Anne. So basically the format of this discussion is going to be very informal, in as much as whatever questions you may have, please write them into the chat and I'll pass them over to Anne Garréta, our guest today. So we'll start asking questions and so on and so forth. Hello, Anne, how are you?
Hello, very well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's evening in your side of the world. It's just early afternoon for me. I'm somewhere near Washington, D.C. in the United States. Glad to see everyone, even the ones I don't see, but I hope to hear from you.
Yes, we hope to hear from you. So we're here because basically we're here for you for a book, for your first book, Sphinx, which was published in 1986. So basically to put us into the background of the whole thing, if Georges Perec with La Disparition in 1969 used the constraint of the lipogram, which was getting rid of the E of the feminine form of language, you, our guest, Anne Garréta, with your debut novel, Sphinx, 1986, contributed to the construction of a writing of lack, of a genderlessness, which by playing on the occultation or disappearance of the gender, exploited the potential of the unspoken and unexpectedly interpreted the unspeakable. So we are going to go towards unspeakability and things that we cannot say and express. But before that, I just want to present you to some people who may not know you. So you're French, you're from Paris. Stop me if I say horrible things or wrong things about you. You're French, you're from Paris. You're a graduate of the École Normale Supérieure. You did your degree, licence de lettres at the Université Paris 4 Sorbonne, your maîtrise, master's, and your DOA, which was back then the first year of the PhD at Paris 7 Diderot. And then you moved to the United States in order to study, to live, to work. And you worked, you did the PhD in NYU, New York University, which was back in 1988. And this PhD was on the end of novels in the 17th and 18th French literatures. So the notion of ends is very, very important. I've recognized a face here whom I'm not going to name among the guests, but this person wanted to do a PhD on the beginning of unspoken, of unwritten novels. She will recognize herself, and we know her gender at least. You have stayed in Ireland, you have stayed, not in Ireland, you have stayed in America, but you are kind of moving in between America and France. You have taught in America at Princeton in 1990, at the University of Virginia, Charlottesville in 95, before coming to Duke University, where you are a research professor of literature and romance studies. And this you can do because you're also only from l'Université Rennes 2 in Paris, France. So we know you from the general public because as an author. Okay, your first novel, 1986, and I'm not going to list them all because there are too many, but first novel, Sphinx by Grasset, chez Grasset, translated to English by Emma Ramadan in 2015. This was published with Deep Vellum. That was published when you were 23. It was hailed by critics, and as Thierry Lagneau said, it tells the love story between people without giving any indication of grammatical gender for the narrator or the narrator's love interest. Then that was followed the following year by Pour en finir avec le genre humain chez Françoise Bourin. Then Ciel liquide, Grasset, which is also about the loss of language. Then there is an interesting one, La Décomposition, in 1919. Actually, talking about La Décomposition, what did Proust ever do to you?
Lots of things. That's the point of a good writer. It does lots of things to whoever reads the book. But the book was not, you could say it's the character in the book tries to decompose Proust, but it's not a book against Proust. It's basically reviving Proust while killing at the same time people in the real world. So it's a serial killer who uses Proust as a method, as a pattern for choosing victims. It's Proust can be put to lots of uses.
Yeah, and that was an excellent one. I've seen somebody in the audience who's also into detection and so on and so forth.
Yes.
2002, Pas un jour, Grasset. Pas un jour was awarded the Prix Médicis, and it's an autobiographical novel around 12 of your memories, again translated by Emma Ramadan under the title of Not One Day, and also published with Deep Vellum. And then you worked on a co-written text with
Jacques
Roubaud, on Eros Melancholique. And last year came, 2017, I've lost time here. 2017, we have Dans le béton by Grasset.
Which is going to appear in English this April. I worked on the translation with Emma Ramadan again last summer, and it's going to appear, it's going to be published in April here in the United States in translation.
Okay, so, well, since you're talking about it, obviously French is a very strongly gendered language. Okay, English is not. How did you go about the writing of Sphinx, and then how did your translator go about it? Because she basically has to translate something which is untranslatable.
I don't think anything is untranslatable. It's just a question of the choices and what you decide to focus on. I would say that everything is translatable. The question is, how many of your darlings are you willing to kill in the process of translation in order to preserve the things that seem to be crucial to the meaning making of the text? So you have languages have very different grammars, and this categorem, which is a principle of categorization of objects and subjects in certain languages, is instantiated and divides or sorts things into two genders, sometimes three, and you also have languages with more categories. Okay. English is weakly gendered, French is strongly gendered, but not in the same way, for example, as German. The German translation of Sphinx had other problems because the mark of gender is not carried by the same units in the language. So you can always find ways around the given structure of a language. The problem is it can sometimes become awkward, and it can sometimes stick out like a sore thumb. What is important in the translation is to make it still readable, okay? Just as in French, it's not obvious to do a genderless novel in French simply because there are so many marks of gender. So you have to adopt strategies, and you have to see where the mark of gender is going to be necessary, and you have to avoid those spaces in language and try to build your path through the language by using different provinces, different ways to tell a story. And it works, it's doable. It's a little complicated, but it's doable. Once you have gotten yourself into the practice of circumventing the marks of gender, then you can write hundreds and hundreds of pages. I could have rewritten À la recherche du temps perdu without gender if I had wanted to in 1986. It's a question of training. You run the thing in your mind, and then your brain, it's like playing an instrument. You're able to play it simply because you've practiced it. But there's not simply the question of the mark of gender, the grammatical mark of gender. When you're writing a story which takes place in a given social world, then there are marks of gender, which are social marks of gender. Certain habits, certain activities which are coded as masculine or feminine. And another part which is not very often spoken about is how do you manage to neutralize this social division of labor, which is everywhere at work in our environments. So it's a question there in the novel. What I did, it's a constant balancing to neutralize for each of the characters, each of the two characters, all of the possible descriptions of a gender, of a social gender identity. So that's how I did it at the time. Carrying it over in English is simple. I sat down in the fall of, when was that? Some fall, at some point. There used to be a fall that I used to spend in Paris.
Before the end of the world.
Before the end of the world. And I sat down with Emma Ramadan, and we systematically looked at marks of gender in French, marks of gender in English, and found technical solutions for the carrying over from one language to the other of this gender neutralization. And then she did the translation.
Okay. And where did you technically get the idea back in 1986 to do that?
That's an interesting question. I mean, two things, and I remember very clearly. Around the early 80s, something had happened. There was a shift around the turn of the 70s, 80s, particularly in the understanding or in the debates around feminism. I was not fully aware of everything at the time, but I know that I was powerfully irritated by one branch of feminism in France, the one that claimed a specificity of the feminine. And it irked me because I couldn't, for the life of me, distinguish between good old patriarchal categorization of objects as feminine or masculine and a brand of feminism which did exactly the same and claimed an essence of the feminine. So it irked me powerfully, and I decided not to write a screed or to do theory about that. I decided to test the possibility of writing without giving any marks of gender and see what it could produce. It's an experiment, you see. It's an experiment. If I tell you a love story, can you suspend, just for a second, this general machine, a social machine, linguistically driven and enforced, of assignation of gender, which is not simply assignation of gender, but also assignation to a series of roles. Okay, so it's called, for me, it's an experimental novel, and it was an experiment.
And what was the reaction of the feminist readership back then? Because this is highly political.
Yes, it's political. Well, there are two, let's say, there are two strains of French feminism. There's one that has got, that became hegemonic. It is Psychepo, it is the differentialist feminism, the one that was received in the United States as French feminism, erasing another side of the debates of the 70s, which was, in my opinion, far more interesting, far more powerful, and far more radical, and which is represented in literature by a writer like Monique Wittig. Maybe some of you have read The Straight Mind and other essays. Maybe some of you have read Monique Wittig's novels, published chez Minuit, starting in 1964. At the time I wrote Sphinx, I had not read Monique Wittig. Okay, so basically I had to reinvent the wheel. But retrospectively, when I came to the United States, I realized that there was someone who had been thinking and writing in French and who had had ideas that I pretty much shared. So it was a belated realization for me. The problem is that this strain of feminism, which has been absolutely crucial to the emergence of what is known now and vulgarized as queer theory, was at the time suppressed, erased in France. It was not, you couldn't find it. All right. So this is indeed, and this was political, and it still is in many ways.
Oh, totally. Is this one of the reasons why you felt more at ease in America?
Yes, not because America is a utopian paradise of all things radical and political, as we know, but simply because seeing things from the outside in, is quite enlightening. When you're at the center of a given culture or society, you live smug, under the delusion that everything which is possible is at your fingertips. I truly believe that it is necessary to go outside, to go away, to take a tangent in order to actually perceive one's position.
This is just between you and me, Anne. Did you notice they're very quiet? They don't ask questions.
Why?
I don't know.
I'm sure they have lots of them.
I'm sure they have love. They're very quiet. We'll continue and we'll see.
Maybe we can. Right. We could. But I'd like to hear. It's not because you and I are at the center of this conversation that something is not going to come from the margin and to displace slightly what we think.
We need to be displaced. We're all displaced.
We need to be jolted a bit.
Oh God, we do. There's one question for you. Were the characters' genders in Sphinx purely unknowable, or did they exist outside the gender binary altogether?
Okay, that's a fair question, and it's a very good one. All right, I think it's the same thing, or it's one of the lessons of Proust, which I had read at the time. When you want to become a novelist, you need... novelists are not poets, okay? A novelist is stuck in the prose of the world, in the social circumstances, in material existence, and I've always been convinced that a good novelist should have curiosity for all of the processes, for everything that exists in the world. Now, how do you create a character in a novel, which is a fiction? All right? There's a very good procedure for that, which is hybridization. You create characters by taking real life examples, hybridizing them with other real life examples, and mixing. It's like a DJ, basically. It's a process of DJing. You take tracks, you mix them together, you pick a part from here, you pick a part from there, and you try to construct something that does not exist in nature. All right. So the models for each of the characters exist, and they were certainly gendered. But the point, and I told you again, the point is to neutralize the ascription of gender, which is so constant and relentless in the language and in the social world. So the character's gender became unknowable as a function of the procedure I applied in order to create them, to fashion them, to design them. Okay? So you cannot dream outside of the gender binary. You have, and it's the same thing for every social or political intervention, you have to take what is and you have to construct the alternative to the grammatical and social dispensation which is given to you or handed to you by your era, your circumstances, and where you chance to be born and to be living.
And just to remind people, the question is better to type them in the chat and then I'll feed them on to you, because otherwise we'll have a collapse in terms of sound. Somebody's asking, were you nervous about creating this genderless novel? Did it require courage of some sorts?
That's interesting. Two things. Let me tell you something, which is, for reasons that, that I could explain, I've never been very much prey to fear. I've always been somewhat reckless and fearless. And for example, the fact that, I just plunged into nightclubs, the world of nightclubs, did all sorts of things in that era indicates that I was, I didn't care much about danger. I could even say, and it's not, I think that I did not actually know fear until very recently in life, when I had children. Before I had children, I didn't know what fear was. Okay, it's very strange because suddenly, a few years back, I suddenly started experience an emotion or an affect I had never known before, which was fear. So I can say, no, I was not fearless. I was curious to know whether the experiment would succeed and whether I could impose or I could make this experiment and take it outside of the small circle of the readers I knew and really imprint it on as an experience in the culture, i.e. publish it, make it public, take it outside of the realm of the private language and make it public. And it was not easy, but it actually succeeded. And I was very happy about that. I was also happy at all of the manifestations of censorship that I got. The fact, for example, that, so it was published by Grasset, that first novel, but the first people to whom I sent the novel and whom I would have expected to publish it were Le Seuil. Why Le Seuil at the time? Because it was the publisher of Roland Barthes, it was the publisher of all sorts of things which were supposed to be radical and avant-garde. And I also tried to publish it with Minuit, which I also knew was really avant-garde, even though I had not read Monique Wittig. I knew that there was something going on there. Le Seuil didn't publish it because the main editor at Le Seuil said that my novel was perverse. And I find this absolutely delightful. Right. The day I learned that they had refused my novel because they found it perverse, I felt vindicated. I felt I had won. There was something there that was touching a nerve. So I just needed to try again and again until it got published.
Oh, yeah, no. That's completely right. Perversion all the way. I had another question. Oh, yes. You brought up DJing. If somebody wants to know if you can say a little about being a DJ, how it influenced Sphinx connection.
Okay. So it's actually something that I'm writing about at the moment. I am trying to write a book which looks back, but this was 1986. I was very young, and there were lots of things I didn't know and I couldn't understand at the time. And I'm trying to look back onto this experience of being a DJ or becoming a DJ. So my current project, or one of my current projects, is a kind of work in progress with the title, which would be Portrait of the Artist as a DJ. And the question is, how did I become a DJ? What did it mean to be a DJ? And what are the consequences, culturally, literally, of being a trained DJ? Because it changes something. If you do something for any amount of time, it changes the way your brain is wired. It changes the way you do things. It changes the way you perceive the world. And it changes the way you go about composing either academic papers, classroom interventions, novels. Okay. So I was a DJ for, say, 2 years, 2.5 years. And at the time, it was basically grunt work. It was not that you would be a DJ for one, even if you were a resident DJ, it meant 5 or 6 nights per week, you had to be behind your turntables and getting a crowd, any crowd, not necessarily a crowd of people who came to hear you, but crowds who came, to nightclubs in order to have fun, dance, socialize, etc., and to get them to dance. Now, it's very difficult to get people to dance, actually, and you need to learn a few tricks. And then you need to become proficient technically with the machines. And you need to learn also a mode of composing with time and composing with music, which is not what a conductor, a classical musician will do, or even a rock musician. It's a totally different logic. So I became professionally, I was paid for it, I became a professional DJ. And then I left. And I was not a DJ for a lot of years. And then I started again DJing here and there, but in a totally different technological environment. When I learned to be a DJ, it was all turntables, vinyls, and analog technology. Nowadays, you can do at the push of a button things that took me weeks, if not months, to master, like beat matching, like beat juggling, etc., etc. So the technology has changed, but the underlying cultural process of composition has not changed. It's not in Sphinx that you will find the most obvious traces of being a DJ, besides the description of being a DJ. You can find it more in La Décomposition, where basically everything is made of samples. La Décomposition is built according to this modern logic of sampling and remixing pre-existing objects. So think of it this way. I sampled and remixed Marcel Proust in La Décomposition. Okay, so that's the logic. This is the most DJ-like type of novel. It's also at the same time, it's a hybridization of the sampling and remixing, DJing logic, and the logic of video games. Okay, so two things. If you are, it's possibly my most complex novel in technical terms, and nobody's tried to translate it yet. Okay. The other one, which is also very much done according to the logic of DJ and improvisation, is Pas un jour, because the idea is it's a live improvised performance, which I do for myself and then I publish. That's how Pas un jour was composed. So these two novels have more of the marks or the traces of this practice that I learned a long, long time ago. Mm-hmm. Does that answer the question?
Oh, yes, it does. It does. We have loads more questions. Actually, before we move towards gender-focused questions, we have from somebody whose name I think is probably English or Irish, sorry. Somebody says, I read Sphinx in English. Would reading it in French be a good idea? So this is about the positioning of the reader within translation, to translations.
Depends. It depends what you're looking for and what your French is like, because there's some things that you're going to get from the French version, which are all of the intertextual stylistic echoes of a very classical French literature. There's another lesson that I had learned from Proust, which I had not formulated fully around the time I wrote Sphinx, but which I already sensed. Proust is a very strange writer, if you think about it. This guy is now heralded as a kind of epitome of Frenchness. He's the Frenchest of French writers. He has told us something about France which seems to be thoroughly traditional. You have all of these charming little churches nestled in the French countryside. You have all of the portrayal of the old society. It's a bit of Saint-Simon, a bit of Madame de Sévigné, plus a bit of all of these reactionary French writers of the late 19th century talking about the soil, the provinces by difference with the corruption of the city. And at the same time, if you look at Proust, he was half Jewish, he was homosexual, and he was a mondain. And he managed to fold between a few church decorations and the classical novel of high society plot, the entire Sodom and Gomorrah plot, which are basically exploding from the inside the logic and the constraints of the classical French novel. So there is a strategic lesson in Proust, which is, if you want to blow up the order of your society, at least culturally, then you have to do it in a stealth way. That's also what many critics theorized as the Trojan horse theory of literature. And as my grandmother told me, on n'attrape pas des mouches avec du vinaigre. So if you're going to achieve any radical aims culturally, you have to calibrate precisely your intervention. Thus, the cover for Sphinx, which is very much a cover of Le Passé Simple, of classical French prose, of certain of the signifiers of good old French traditional literature. It's Catholic as Mauriac, that novel. Just as Catholic as Mauriac, if you see what I mean.
No, I think you're right as well. If we go back to the issues of genre, not of genre, gender, I'm going back to the questions from the audience. Oh yeah, that's an interesting one as well. Did the degendering devices you had to apply, particularly in strongly gendered French, limit in any way your range of expression?
No, and that's, I think, au contraire, I would say, on the contrary. And that's the Oulipian idea, and it's a very strong one, which is constraints, i.e. a limit forces you to invent in other areas. I had to go to modes of representations that I would otherwise not have had access to if I could have done the things, the lazy way. All right? So, for example, what it does, it produces very strange effects in the characterizations of characters, in the ways they can be perceived within the fiction of the narration. And, lots of people have told me, but, I've objected to that. And you have some people who have strange ideas about what literature is supposed to be and to do. Your characters are fragmented. They appear as fragmented pieces of bodies. Yes, they do. And this is an artifact of the method, but what it gives access to, it's like cubism. you get a kind of strange perspective on what makes the unity of a character and its free identification. So it's again experimental. You apply the constraint and it does something to your forms of perceptions and to the structures of intelligibility of your world. And it makes them strange, and this is what is interesting.
Yeah. At the beginning of your answer, you mentioned the Oulipo. Can you remind people who may not know what it is, because this is a very French thing? And you were the first person to be elected onto the Oulipo, to have been born after the birth of the Oulipo, basically.
Right.
So the new baby on the block.
So, which means that literally I was already post-Oulipian. And I think we're living in post-Oulipian times. Okay, so let me explain what the Oulipo, I think, is. So, seen from the outside, the Oulipo is a group, a workshop, un ouvroir, rather than these classical literary groups like the Surrealists or whatever, which was founded at the end of 1961 after a décade de cerisier which had been devoted to the work of Raymond Queneau. So Raymond Queneau is a worker around whom this thing cohered or congealed. And the Oulipo is a group that is still surviving all the way to today and has counted members, well known or less well known. But the idea was twofold. The first one was to bridge the gap between the two cultures, literary, the humanities, and the sciences. So you have mathematicians, you have engineers, who are also members of the Oulipo. And they were admitted, or they were important, because the point was to develop a mode of thinking literature which was based on the idea of structures. You could say that the Oulipo happens at the same time and is directly linked to Bourbaki, the mathematical group, which tries to rewrite entirely mathematics on the basis of an axiomatics. You could say the Oulipo was trying to rewrite and reconstruct literature on the basis of an axiomatics, and you call your axiomatics the constraints. It is also linked with the emergence of structuralism at the time, and it is linked to the idea, which is not separate from that development in mathematics and in the human and social sciences, of computers and of cybernetics. Now, retrospectively, when I look at it, I think that we live in post-Oulipian times because nowadays our entire cultural logic is Oulipian. Everything is driven in our culture by the machines we use, which are algorithmic machines. Music is being created, composed, produced, and performed thanks to highly computer-driven processes. I told you about, now the press of a button, you can do beat matching, you can do beat juggling without effort. Everything being computerized has been Oulipianized. Or put it the other way, the Oulipo was at the avant-garde when it was founded, in the sense that it anticipated modes of cultural productions that are now ubiquitous. The machines, you could say that an Oulipian was turning himself or herself into a machine and running a program of constraints in their minds in order to output certain types of texts. Look at the classical Oulipian constraints, S+7. Look at the way Perec built his novels. It's machinic processes that are being run on human brains in the Oulipo. And in the case of Perec, and also, for example, of Calvino, the point is not simply to turn the humans into machines. The point is to see when the machine ceases to function, or how the human can trip the machine and make the program go awry. So the point here, and Oulipo, the Oulipian thing is very interesting from that standpoint. You have some very strong writers, possibly some of the strongest writers of the late 20th century came out of an Oulipian way of thinking. Calvino, Perec, to mention only two of the most important.
In terms of knowing the way the machine knows us, when you are writing your novel, and this is coming from a question here, somebody says, I would have imagined that as an author, you would know your characters well, though you may have tried to hide the gender aspect from the reader. Did you succeed in doing so for yourself? Basically, the question is, did you generate a, and then said, okay, A is going to be no one, no, or is going to be everybody, or I is a woman and I'm then going to masculinize it? This is, I think, where the question is going. The relationship between you and your character, time of the genesis of the character.
All right. Remember also something, which is the attempt at defying the normative ordering of bodies across, or along certain categorizations is not something that is done only in literature. It's done in everyday life by a lot of people. And it's always been one of the places where artists have gravitated towards. Think, for example, I don't know, George Sand asking for a special dispensation in order to be able to dress like a man, to be able to walk through the streets of Paris, to do a job as a journalist and as a writer. Think of all of the constructions in art of gender bending appearance. Think Marcel Duchamp with Eros c'est la vie. Okay? The famous picture of Marcel Duchamp with une voilette, a little thing, and the hands of somebody else, of a woman, so as to confuse the appearance. So this is a very old aesthetic and social practice. And my point is not to know the gender of the character. My point is what happens, and my quest was, what happens when you manage to suspend the social work of the ascription of gender? What are the horizons that can be opened? What type of love story do you get? And what does it do to people's understanding of their own desires? So that's the experience thing. The point is not to know. It's a skeptical point. It's a point of suspension of belief in the categories of gender.
Which is the whole point of queer theory and of movement. I mean, this is where you're starting everything from. Let
me mention one thing. Queer theory gets articulated very precisely. We can date it around 1990s. That's when when it pops up. Teresa de Lauretis and Judith Butler. Judith Butler, everyone knows. Teresa de Lauretis is even more interesting, and I encourage everyone to read Teresa de Lauretis. Okay, this is 1990. The book I wrote between 1984 and 85. It was finished in 1985. And it's a point on which I insist, which is literature is in advance of any theory. Put it another way, the construction of new concepts is in advance of their conceptualization. And this is super important. I didn't write the book because I had read Teresa de Lauretis of Judith Butler. I had not read them because I had not yet written that. Okay. And it is super important to think of the humanities and of literature still in this sense, making things perceptible before they can be thought. There is, language allows us that. Language thinks ahead of us if we know how to use it, or if we work hard enough at it.
Which is why very often I was listening to some of your interviews when preparing for today, and writing comes not difficultly, but you need to work a lot on it. It's not a smooth process. So why do you keep doing it to yourself?
Good question. It's a good question. I think there are two things to say to that. The number one thing is I still think of myself as an experimental writer, in the sense that I create prototypes, i.e. things that do not yet exist. And the problem is that it takes a lot more time and a lot more effort, and also a lot more idleness, or moments when I'm actually not writing, before I get the idea of a possible new way of doing something. If I applied a given formula, and repeated it again and again, I would write much more, and I would be probably a wealthier writer, put it this way. Okay, there are people who manage to publish one novel every year or every 2 years. I can't do that. I can't. Because none of my novels repeats the preceding ones. Each time I try to do something different. The other thing is, it's worth it and it's not worth it. In economic terms, it's totally crazy. Okay, in the sense that I can never capitalize, or I cannot make a living out of what I write. That's why I have other jobs. But on the other hand, there's nothing which is more interesting to me or more fascinating than to challenge the understanding I have, or the knowledge I have of something. If I don't discover something I didn't know beforehand, if it's not an experiment, it's boring to me. It's, it's like, bungee jumping. It's dangerous, but there's a thrill to it.
Never bungee jumped, so I couldn't tell you, but I don't want to try either.
No, but I would like to. It's basically what I do. You jump into a void. You're not following a path which has already been outlined. It's really jumping into a void. But first you have to prepare, the bungee cord.
And it's interesting what you're saying, because as a reader of the text, I was doing the exercise of reading one chapter. Okay, we have one man and one woman, and then A was female and the narrator was male, and then it's two guys, and then it's two. So we also jump into the abyss, because some things, depending on our gender orientation or sexual identity, we feel more related to, and then we realize it doesn't matter. The erasing of the genre, the erasing of the gender has allowed for a better understanding of the human character.
Right. So it's not an erasure, it's a suspension.
Yeah.
And it's important to think of it as a suspension, because you're constantly being bounced from one hypothesis to another, until you realize that the main point might not be that, or that there are other things to perceive besides that, or that the perception or the suspension allows you to perceive something else.
Which is probably why there are so many elements connected with thresholds and movements and transitions or transcending as well in the novel. Especially when, it's a very urban novel, obviously. We have New York.
It's not bucolic at all.
No,
Not
it's not.
utilizable.
No. We won't have the little flowers on that one, but why not? And how important is the city for you? And how important is it in the novel?
It's very important for the novel because all of the social phenomena, the musical things, the social landscapes, it's all urban. It's nightclubs in urban cities at a precise moment. This is also what I'm reconstructing in my portrait of the artist as a DJ. At the time, um, as I was a DJ, I I was traveling. I had money. I would fly to New York. I would fly to Berlin. I would fly to Munich, and I would go to nightclubs. And there was this kind of already. It was the beginning of globalization, if you want. The circulation of people and cultural goods was intensifying, and you had phenomena which are very visible in the circulation of music and the hybridizations of the various genres of music that are going to explode later in the 80s and the 90s in house, in techno, etc. So made of every sort of things that are starting to slowly congeal and cohere, and at the same time are getting dispersed across the thing. This happens in urban environments. It's an urban life. It's an urban night.
And the characters, which are the city in your novel, are always characters that are either decayed, Harlem, um, seen from somewhere else. I mean, when the narrator is in the street, we have the feeling that there's a kind of dialogue, an embodied dialogue with the character in New York, and then the character at the end, when attacked in Harlem, drowns into the canal. Is the city dangerous?
It's Amsterdam. And of course, if you've read enough of your French classics, you know that this is basically a remixing or a rehearsing of La Chute by Camus.
Yeah.
So it's another of the layers of intertextual meaning there. Of course, the city is dangerous. All cities are dangerous. Uh, but that's because they're places of heavy, dangerous social experimentation. And some of these experimentations are in the novel itself.
I have seen another question arrive, which takes us back to the Oulipo.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, what is your opinion on understanding of conceptual art, and how does it differ from Oulipo in motivation and in process?
A little known fact, which I'm going to state now, is Marcel Duchamp was a member of the Oulipo. He had been elected to the Oulipo because he was a friend of François Le Lyonnais, one of the two co-founders of the Oulipo. The other founder of the Oulipo is Raymond Queneau. And Duchamp is a very interesting, I mean, if you think about conceptual art, there's a source to it. It's Duchamp when Duchamp says, okay, enough of this turpentine intoxication of peinture de chevalet, we are now going to do art in a different way. That's the basis at the beginning for conceptual art. So there is indeed a link. There's an intensely abstract process there where you would say that what matters to the Oulipo is not the final object, it's the conceptualization of ways of making art or literature. And it's very much a mathematization or an abstraction of the processes of art. François Le Lyonnais also had this idea that l'Oulipo was only a particular case of a more general possible structure of potential, which was the ou expo, whereby you could replace X, as in mathematics, by anything. And indeed, you've had examples of that. So the real conceptual move was that of François Le Lyonnais. François Le Lyonnais was a conceptual artist who produced very little, but conceptualized a lot, including the Oulipo. So you have ouvroir de droit potentiel, ouvroir de cuisine potentielle, ouvroir de musique potentielle, ouvroir de génétique potentielle. Everything has a potential to be potential if you think about it.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. So I could go into deeper considerations about conceptual arts and the sources of the Oulipo, but they're cognates. There's a correlation here which is very strong, and a historical coincidence.
I was also,
I look at the track, it's Teresa de Laurentis, not Laurentis.
Oh yeah, my ends.
Sorry for the typo.
Sorry for the typo.
And no H, she's Italian.
And in an interview on your latest novel, Dans le béton, this was, I think it was in the France Culture program, and said, prendre la langue au pied de la lettre, c'est faire apparaître un peu de radicalité. Ça prend du temps d'écrire. So you were talking in Dans le béton about your positioning towards writing. If we want to bridge your first novel with your last novel, Dans le béton, and maybe with the one that you're writing now, did your relationship with language change?
Okay, Jean-Philippe, I'm going to take a tangent here, and I'm going to circle back to the question of conceptual art. Actually, I am not in favor of conceptual art. I'm very much in favor of something that thinks very, very materially and pays very close attention to the texture, the material texture of the medium. Okay, put it this way. And for me, language is not a symbolic code, simply, a string of symbols. There's something else about language, which is eminently tactile. And I have the same relationship with music. Music is this very paradoxical thing, and it's very close for me to the question of language. When you compose music, you use symbols to represent things, but then there's a difference between the score and the performance. And there is a specificity, the materiality of the performance, its audible nature, all of the quirks, all of the things that are not represented in the symbolic partition of the thing. This is super important for me, and it is part of what I try to do in language. And the fact that even though I'm simply a novelist and I write prose, I'm extremely careful about the rhythm of sentences and extremely sensitive to the way it sounds. And so the other effort in translation, when I work with my translator Emma Ramadan, is not simply to get the meaning right, it's to get the rhythm, the texture of language properly translated. And in the case of Dans le béton, I mean, there are some very strange effects that you will not notice, but there's a texturing, there's a patterning of the sentences. That is something I could not quite achieve when I was a very young writer and I wrote Sphinx, but I think that I've gotten better at it. I've made progress. I'm a better instrumentist. Not simply composer, but I can play it better.
And maybe a last question, because I'm really sorry, I just see the time that is going. Your book is, it could be seen as a dark book, but it's not a dark book. I mean, we do have 3 deaths. The first one is hilarious. The second one is the death of the mother is, actually I found it very strong. And this is a personal question. I'm really sorry I'm using this time here. I felt very close to the mother of A to A's mother. Now, I was wondering whether it's because I'm a parent with a child in another country, or maybe because she's gendered, we know her. I don't know. But my question is, we have three deaths. It's not dark, but it's about the end. And what you have a fascination with ends and endings, don't you?
I'm interested in figuring out how things end. Yes. Okay. I think your question has two or three different prongs. One is, why do fictional character and what happens to them? How can it affect us? How does it touch us? Okay, this is a real question. How, when you write, do you make it affecting enough that it's going to do something to your readers, that it's going to, the string of words or symbols on the page is going to move something in the reader? It's quite mysterious. There are some, recipes for that, but some of them are really hackneyed, and, it's called, a tearjerker. The problem is, how do you produce a tearjerker without using any of the recipes for tearjerking? That's the one thing. I would say that in that novel, if I had to analyze it, it's a repetition of the death which produces the affect, or affect is a function of repetition. Okay? The second thing is about ends and endings. I mean, that's generally how stories end, either a marriage or a death, or the recognition of something. That's the endings of stories. And as for the number of death and the basically haunting by death in this novel, as I reflect, there's something you have to remember, that this was written in 84, 86. And there's a kind of not visible, but it's going to be the same again in Ciel Liquide and in La Décomposition. And it's something that has been reactivated, I would say, nowadays, culturally. It was a time when AIDS was basically starting to strike. It had already, started, and it had been identified, and it would amplify and amplify the wave of death. I used to go to nightclubs. I used to go in New York to a nightclub which was called The Saint. AIDS in New York in the mid-80s, when I went to that club, was known as the Saint's disease, because, all of the people were members of that club. 95% of them ended up dead. So there is something in the background of this urban life, and you could say it's a kind of spectral figuration of AIDS. And you find it in other writers. For example, if you read Philippe Vasset, you have the impression that his landscapes have been emptied of any human life. It's because an epidemic has, ruined the entire social life of that era. So that's, three strains or streams of possible answer, and we could go further into that.
And I think we will not have time. And I think we just have time now to thank you so very much for having accepted to spend time with us, Anne Garréta. Thank you so much. Our conversation went a little bit everywhere because that was the idea. We don't know where questions came from, but you must be exhausted. We're very sorry to have challenged you like that, but thank you very, very much.
Thank you for the question, and thank you everyone in the audience for coming up with questions that really, I mean, I expect questions. I've been doing this for years, but the questions, brought something new, some angles that I had not expected. So it was still an experimental thing, and there are things that I had not thought through before that I managed to articulate today, and I'm thankful for that. I'm really thankful. Thank you for those questions. and bearing with me on the experiment.
It was our pleasure. So thank you and goodbye, and see you all for a next edition of this book club, of this European Book Club. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, and take very good care. Be safe, please. Be safe.
Safe. Be safe.
These are dangerous times. Be safe.
Absolutely, and we look forward to having you all for our next session. This was the second session of this series, and the next time we will welcome, after Italy and France, Germany. And the Goethe Institute will be hosting a conversation with Dr. Hansen. This will be on the 8th of April. In May, it will be the Instituto Cervantes. The conversation will be with Andres Barba. And finally, we will wrap up with Cultural Island. That will be on the 3rd of June. And our guest will be Anne Enright. So we look forward to seeing you to our next meeting on the 8th of April with Stuart Hansen, and the meeting will be hosted by the Goethe Institute. And in the meantime, as we all said, stay home, stay safe, et à bientôt. Bonsoir.